Judas Iscariot wasn't the villain of Christianity, he may have been its most sacred hero. In a forgotten chamber beneath an ancient Syrian monastery, a hooded figure holds a tattered manuscript to the light. The Gospel of Judas, hidden for centuries, tells a story the church never wanted you to know. Judas didn't betray Jesus out of greed or weakness. The man history condemned as history's greatest traitor was actually carrying out Jesus's most sacred command, a secret mission that required him to sacrifice not just his teacher's life, but his own eternal reputation. The silver coins weren't payment for betrayal. They were tokens of the ultimate sacrifice. What if the most reviled figure in religious history was actually Christ's most loyal apostle, deliberately playing the villain in a cosmic drama only he and Jesus understood? The cinematic opening lingers like a whisper. It feels like a secret revealed. Yet this version, the dramatic, mysterious Judas, is not the one most people were taught in Sunday school. Before we pry open the sealed files, let's rehearse the comfortable story everyone already knows. For 2,000 years, Christianity has handed down a tidy tale. Judas Iscariot as the consummate traitor, the man who sold his master for 30 pieces of silver. It is a story that fits neatly into sermons and schoolbooks. It offers a villain with a bow tie of motives: greed, cowardice, weakness. You have seen him in films and paintings, lonely, furtive, counting coins while the choir rises. The image is simple. It is moral. It comforts. On stage, the detail work does the job. Judas is the group's treasurer. He fusses over a money bag. In one scene, he objects to an expensive perfume, a petty critic of generosity. In another, at the Last Supper, Satan enters him and he slides away into night. The gospel authors give the audience what it wants: motive, action, consequence. The betrayal is cinematic. A kiss in the dark, a troop of soldiers led to an unarmed teacher. The tragic arc is tidy. Remorse follows. Suicide completes the cautionary circle. This version serves multiple functions. It solves theological problems. If Jesus was divine, the story of his arrest and execution needed a human villain to blame. Someone had to bear the smell of guilt. The early community needed an explanation that preserved divine purity while marking human fallibility. Judas fit the script. He was the disposable scapegoat who explained how a Messiah might be handed over to death without the divine being implicated in betrayal. It also teaches moral lessons. Greed, envy, treachery, these are sins the faithful must avoid. The Judas story is a stick for educators. It plays well at the pulpit and in the schoolroom. It draws sharp lines. Be like Peter in his courage. Do not be like Judas. Simple stories are pedagogically powerful. They keep the flock in line. The story is culturally amplified by art and performance. In medieval altarpieces, Judas is often shown with a money bag, hunched and ugly, the very emblem of greed. Dante puts him in the deepest pit of hell. Renaissance paintings make him red-haired and furtive. Modern cinema borrowed the shorthand. Judas equals betrayal. You might remember the arrowed close-ups, the breathy betrayal music. Judas is made unmistakable so that audiences need not pause to wonder. There is also theological engineering at work. Gospel writers shape details to satisfy prophetic expectations. 30 pieces of silver is no neutral number. It resonates with Old Testament imagery and gives Matthew, especially, a theological hook. This is prophecy fulfilled. That is convenient. It ties Jesus' fate to Scripture and makes the narrative appear as part of a divine plan, except the plan needs a human scapegoat to function in public imagination. Who benefits from this neat arrangement? Institutions and authors who prefer a story with a moral villain. Hierarchies that need a scapegoat to stabilize doctrine. Artists and storytellers who find in Judas a ready-made antagonist. Societies that rely on moral exempla. The version is comfortable because it removes messy questions. Did Jesus orchestrate his own arrest? What does that mean for choice and culpability? Better to keep those questions folded into a single archetype, the traitor. The presentation is smooth. Conflicting details are smoothed over. Discrepancies between gospel accounts are downplayed in catechisms and film scripts. The result is not so much a single lie as a curated myth, selected facts polished until they gleam. It is a story that reads well in a program, and so it endures. Even as the tidy narrative takes hold, small cracks exist in plain sight. Different gospels tell different versions of Judas's motivation. The way he dies is inconsistent. Dates and motives shift when read carefully. But the story is so useful that audiences often ignore these problems. Comfort beats curiosity. You have heard this version. You saw it in movies. You learned it in school. It is familiar. It explains. It calms. And yet, once a story is familiar, it becomes invisible. You stop checking seams. You forget that narratives are constructed. That silence is the engine of authority. When a comfortable myth goes unchallenged, it ossifies into cultural fact. At that point, the question is not whether the story is accurate, but whether it suits the needs of those who tell it. So what happens when someone starts pulling at those seams? What small inconsistency is enough to start unraveling an entire tapestry? The answer is more than you might expect. Behind the curtains, there are versions that do not fit the villain template. Documents, later gospels, and political motives complicate the tidy picture. And once those elements are placed under a lamp, the neat villain becomes a much darker, messier human being, perhaps even a tragic accomplice to a plan none of the popular narratives were brave enough to admit. Before we look at those contradictions, a quick note. If you find this investigation gripping, consider subscribing to the channel. This series is young. Each new subscriber helps fund deep dives into histories your textbook skipped. If you want more cases that make you question what you knew, hit subscribe and help push us toward 1,000 so we can keep chasing the inconvenient files together. The neat story begins to crack as soon as the Gospels are opened side by side. The four canonical accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are not a single, unified record. They are four witnesses writing decades after the events, with different priorities and audiences. Read them in sequence, and the contradictions multiply like shadows in an archive. Start with motive. Matthew gives the clear, almost moralistic answer: money. Judas sells Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. It is easy drama. A love of money leads to betrayal. Luke and John, by contrast, introduce a more cosmic element. Satan enters Judas. The language shifts blame from personal weakness to metaphysical possession. Mark, the earliest gospel we have, oddly offers no clear motive at all. He records the act. He does not explain it. 3 different answers for the same act. Small detail? Not when the whole drama of redemption hinges on why a disciple turned. Then there is the death of Judas. Matthew reports remorse and suicide. Judas returns the blood money. The temple authorities refuse it, and he hangs himself. In Acts, a book traditionally attributed to Luke, there is another story. Judas buys a field with the money, then falls headlong, and his body bursts open. These are not mere stylistic variations. They are irreconcilable sequences. Did he hang? Did he fall? Did he repay the money or use it to buy land? The biographical portrait changes with each telling. Even the prophetic scaffolding is shaky. Matthew ties the 30 pieces of silver to an Old Testament prophecy, claiming fulfillment. But the verses he cites and the wording he adapts better match passages from Zechariah than from Jeremiah. Scholars have long noted that Matthew reworks texts, sometimes amalgamating scriptural lines to make them read as prophecy fulfilled. That is theological creativity, not neutral reporting. It is an author shaping memory to prove a point. A more striking problem is Jesus' own foreknowledge. All 4 Gospels have Jesus predicting his betrayal. John takes this further. Jesus names Judas, tells him, "What you are about to do, do quickly," and even dips bread and hands it to him. That line clinical and almost managerial the Gospel of Judas suppressed and only rediscovered in modern times presents Judas in a strikingly different role. As the disciple who understood Jesus, the one who handed Jesus over at his request so that the spiritual mission could proceed. This text is not a canonical gospel. It is Gnostic, composed in a community with theological agendas at odds with proto-Orthodox Christianity. Yet its very existence proves a point. Early Christianity was plural. Competing narratives coexisted. The story of Judas as a simple traitor is not the only ancient version. It was a version that won. Look closer at the cultural and political context, and the contradictions acquire a sharper edge. First-century Judea was a pressure cooker. Messianic expectations roiled the population. Rome sat as an armed superpower. Various Jewish groups had divergent responses. Some sought violent revolution, others hoped for divine intervention, and some pursued accommodation with the status quo. Jesus and his group operated within these currents. His preaching attracted the poor and the curious, but also the watchful eyes of a temple establishment anxious about unrest and Roman authorities eager to quash anything resembling insurrection. In that charged atmosphere, narratives are weapons. A story that locates blame inside a single, deviant disciple is politically useful. It absolves the crowd and the leadership and entire people from collective responsibility for the death of a charismatic challenger. It recasts a politically messy removal into a moralistic tale about greed. Consider how convenient such a transformation is. No need to reckon with mass hysteria, with the role of the temple officials, with Pilate's politics. Blame is neat and local. Then there is the curious role of the money itself. 30 pieces of silver would have been around 4 months' wages for a laborer, not an amount that typically ruins a person's life. Presenting Judas as motivated by this specific sum casts him as pecuniarily base, but it reads oddly when contrasted with the stakes handing over a teacher who claimed to offer eternal life. It suggests the money detail was chosen for its symbolic resonance rather than its economic logic. That symbolic choice points back to theological shaping rather than a straightforward historical ledger. At several points, the Gospels appear to be retrofitting prophecy onto incident. Matthew's word choices are instructive. He pulls phrases and phrases into his narrative, so the events read as ancient texts coming true. That method has an effect. It makes later readers forget that the author rephrased and selected materials. For generations, that selection would be read as an organic fulfillment rather than a compositional strategy. The strategy is persuasive, and that is precisely why it became standard. Consider, too, how quickly the image of Judas hardened into a stereotype. By the time Christianity became aligned with imperial power, the narrative had been polished into a foundational myth. Church fathers denounced alternative accounts as heresy. Texts like the Gospel of Judas were suppressed. The machinery of orthodoxy did not merely argue, it excluded. Over centuries, images of Judas in art and literature codified the caricature. Dante, medieval preachers, and Renaissance painters layered on moral condemnation until Judas became a byword for ultimate treachery. Yet suppression leaves traces. The very existence of contradictory versions suggests an earlier debate. That debate raises questions that textbooks rarely ask. What if Judas's act had a purpose known to Jesus and perhaps to Judas himself? What if the betrayal was part ritual, part freeing of the spirit, part misread political gamble? These are not comforts for faith, but they are legitimate historical inquiries. The narrative contradictions settle into psychological drama as well. If Judas acted out of political disagreement, if he expected Jesus to seize power and was disillusioned, then his later remorse would read as the horror of being used by forces larger than intention. If he acted at Jesus's prompting, his horror might stem from seeing a teacher executed in a way neither wanted. Both scenarios convert Judas from stock villain into tragic participant. At the end of this sequence of cracks, the viewer should feel unease. The tidy villain model is no longer persuasive. What remains is a more complex human being entangled in political, social, and spiritual storms, a man whose choices cannot be reduced to a single motive easily packaged for sermons. The question that opens is no longer simply, was Judas a traitor? It becomes, who decided which story would survive and why? That question is where the deeper investigation begins. The map of first-century Palestine helps make Judas look less like a caricature and more like a man caught between two worlds. Picture the landscape. The dry spine of Judea, Jerusalem's terraces glittering at midday, markets where Roman coins clinked against pottery, and narrow alleys that kept secrets. Now place Judas in that map. He is not the Galilean fisherman who speaks bluntly and smells of net and lake. He is a Judean, closer to the temple's shadow, to the scribes and the murmur of priests. That detail, subtle as it is, changes everything. Iscariot is not a cosmetic epithet. Scholars have long debated its origin, but one plausible thread leads to the Sicarii, the dagger men. These were zealots who hated collaborators and carried concealed blades. If Judas carried that regional memory in his name, whether by birth, association, or rumor, then his world was full of political noise, informers, oath-sworn groups, whispers of revolt. The Jesus movement, predominantly Galilean in popular imagination, would have looked to someone like Judas as the logical bridge to Jerusalem's more volatile currents. Imagine a scene: dusk on a terrace in Jerusalem. Candles sputter. A woman of means, a supporter of the movement, drops off a small chest of coins. Judas counts, records, tucks away. His fingers know the exact weight of silver that will feed mouths tomorrow. He is careful, methodical, trusted. That is not the image of a petty embezzler. It is the image of someone entrusted with survival. When you learned the story in Sunday school, you saw the money bag as proof of corruption. But here, the money bag looks like responsibility. The Gospels themselves confess strains between competing expectations. On one side are disciples picturing a crown, a trumpet, an overthrow. On the other is a teacher who speaks in parables about a kingdom within and keeps returning to the theme of suffering and loss. Those conversations are not recorded as heated debates in public square. They happen in rooms, at night, behind closed doors. We can almost hear them. The low friction of sandals on stone, the clink of pottery, the muffled cough of someone swallowing doubt. Take Peter as an example. He is impulsive. He swings a sword at the arrest and later denies knowledge of his friend. His confusion is visible. Judas's confusion would have been quieter, but just as intense. If Judas expected a militant Messiah, one who would rally the temple's discontents, then Jesus' steady insistence on a different path would have felt like betrayal to the cause Judas held dear. That is a plausibility the standard narrative rarely acknowledges. Disciples were not unanimous in hope or method. There are hints in the texts of private, sophisticated talk. When Jesus speaks about his death to fulfill Scripture, that phrase is theological shorthand, but it also signals planning. Who around him would understand that language? Who would be capable of undertaking an action that appears to the crowd as betrayal, yet might be interpreted in a closed circle as part of a plan? The man who handled funds and understood Jerusalem's currents fits the brief. We must imagine networks, not the picturesque 12 gathered like a band of brothers, but a movement with patrons, local allies, political censors, and friends inside the city's gate. Judas would have been the node who connected the itinerant teacher with urban dynamics. He likely knew where meetings could occur without Roman notice. He would have known the value of silence, the currency of favors. That makes his presence at the Last Supper less accident than function. These backstage scenes complicate a tidy moral frame. They introduce motives that are political and practical, not merely moralistic or metaphysical. Judas may have been impatient with a program of parables when he wanted programmatic change. He may have been trying to reconcile Jesus' language of necessary death with a strategy. Pause here and ask, if Judas was the one disciple who knew how to navigate Jerusalem, why would he have acted alone? If he was tied into a network, who else bore responsibility? The answer matters, and it is the cue to a scene we think we know, but do not. The Last Supper is staged in the imagination as a small room, a final intimate meal, a beat of tenderness before tragedy. But the text asks us to slow down and see choreography rather than chaos. The air is thick with ritual, plates passed, wine shared, lamps guttering. The room smells of baked bread and oil. There is candle soot on a servant's sleeve. Everyone feels a pressure they cannot name. In that pressure, something cracks toward imperative. John's Gospel gives us the clearest and most unsettling line. A dip of bread, a hand extended, the teacher saying, "What you are about to do quickly." It's a line that flatly refuses the usual morality play and replaces it with direction. In Jewish dining habits, dipping bread for a guest is a gesture of fellowship. It is not, ostensibly, a seal of guilt. The narrative choice to grant Judas the dipped bread reframes the moment. It reads less like accusation and more like commission. Imagine the table as a stage set. Cameras are off. The disciples' faces catch the lamplight. Jesus names a betrayer. They fret and ask in confusion. The motion toward Judas is silent but pointed. No theatrical hiss. No betrayer unmasked with fanfare. Instead, an almost bureaucratic exchange, food, hand, instruction. The nearest modern analogy would be an officer handing sealed orders to a trusted lieutenant in the knowledge that the mission will end in death for the principal. The lieutenant's duty is concealed and terrible. What follows Judas slipping into the night is not confusion so much as the start of an operation. He moves through the dark toward Gethsemane, towards soldiers and priests waiting for a signal. The famous kiss is then read by many as the ultimate symbol of treachery, an intimate sign turned dagger. But pause. A kiss can also be code, a prearranged sign to reduce confusion in the night. If the arresting party feared a mob or might mistake one man for another, a personal sign would be practical. The scene reads differently if we visualize it as signal, not betrayal. Jesus' response at the arrest complicates the melodrama. He calls Judas friend and tells him to do what you came for. That is not the cry of the wounded surprised by a backstab. It is the voice of someone carrying the instruction forward. Then there is Peter's failed defense, violence rebuked and blood healed, and the sense solidifies. This was not an ordinary capture. It was a set piece whose script only a few could read. Where then does remorse enter the picture? Matthew tells of Judas returning the 30 pieces of silver, of shaking hands with priests who refused the money, of Judas hanging himself in despair. The image is cinematic. Coins on a table, a figure in the street, a neck in the shadow. But Luke and Acts tell a different, messy end, a field bought, and then a fall, a corpse disintegrated. The variations are not casual. They betray authors wrestling with the meaning of Judas's last acts: suicide, purchase, remorse, and the theological need to make the sequence fit prophetic molds. That 30 pieces of silver, about 4 months' wages, is also a sign. It's not a fortune. It's a quantity chosen for resonance. Matthew ties it to Scripture to say prophecy was fulfilled. But the very smallness of the sum, when set against the cosmic stakes of God's anointed being handed to death, reads oddly. If the act was purely mercenary, the amount is insufficient motive. If, instead, the sum was a symbol grafted onto a larger plot, its inclusion begins to look like later editorial surgery. Consider the psychology here. If Judas believed he was serving a plan, perhaps even acting to free Jesus' spirit from the chains of the body, horror at an unexpected outcome is plausible. If he thought his action would precipitate a revelatory triumph and instead saw a legal execution, the collapse into despair is comprehensible in human terms. The man who made a terrible tactical choice might have been devastated by its misapplication, but the texts are unclear about his expectations, and that ambiguity has been exploited for centuries. The critical point that refuses to leave the scene: Jesus, in the narratives, predicted his betrayal and named the agent. He told the one who would act to proceed. Those are not the words of someone who is merely surprised. They are the words of someone who understands, perhaps even commands, the sequence. If Jesus orchestrated the event, if he saw death as necessary and arranged for it to happen with a human executor, then the label traitor collapses in on itself. Judas transforms from villain to instrument. Yet the story we inherited refuses that complexity. It prefers a clean villain, a cautionary archetype. Why? Because an orchestrated death leads to darker theological knots. Free will versus divine plan, culpability versus necessity, salvation's machinery revealed. A scapegoat is easier to preach about than a confederate. So the narrative tightens around a single image: the kiss, the coins, the hanging, and erases the choreography. After the arrest comes the cascade. Trials performed with haste, an audience easily moved to condemnation, a governor who washes his hands but makes the political calculation he must. The crucifixion is not just a religious dispatch, it is a political act in a city on edge. In that storm, complex motives and tangled loyalties are compressed into a morality play with a single villain. The real tragedy is not only the death, but the erasure, the careful, painful work of reducing a human into a symbol. As the scene settles, one fact bites. History chose the easy story. The man who may have acted as a charged, tragic intermediary was turned into a moral horror. The choreography, the private understandings, the political pressures, all washed out. What remains, loud and simple, is betrayal. But you have seen the cues now. You have seen the backstage script. That realization reframes everything that comes after, including how the early church, hungry for theological clarity, set about rewriting the margins into doctrine. So ask yourself again, quietly, was Judas a traitor or a tragic facilitator of a plan no one else could accept? The answer is not tidy, but the fact that the question can be asked and that the texts themselves leave space to ask it should be enough to make the official picture feel precarious. Propaganda is not a single poster or one sermon. It is a slow sediment. To see how Judas's image hardened into bone, follow the layers. First layer, the gospel writers. Each author writes decades after the events, to communities with stakes. Mark earliest, terse, pragmatic records the sequence without a motive. It is spare. Matthew writes later for an audience hungry to see prophecy fulfilled. He layers 30 pieces of silver and a citation that leans toward Zechariah, making an event fit scripture. Luke and John add cosmic language. Satan enters Judas a way to locate betrayal in metaphysical evil, not messy human politics. Why does that matter? Because each adjustment reframes responsibility. Move motive from political impatience to spiritual corruption, and an entire set of questions disappears. If Judas is possessed, then the community does not have to investigate internal divisions or the politics that led to crucifixion. The sin is individualized, moralized. That was useful. By the 2nd century, the church is defending doctrine against competing theaters of belief. Gnostic groups offer alternative readings, including the Gospel of Judas, which recasts him as the disciple who understood Jesus best. Irenaeus and other fathers denounce these texts as heretical, but suppression does more than argue. It excises. Libraries collect aloud texts, burn or bury the rest, and in the quiet of module formation, the narrative that best serves institutional coherence becomes the dominant one. Image-making follows text. Medieval art loves symbolism. Judas is painted with a money bag. He is often given exotic features: red hair, a hooked nose that code him as monstrous by the standards of the day. Art is not neutral. It cements the reader's mental iconography. Dante drops him into the deepest pit of hell. Medieval children learn one version, memorized and moralized. When a child hears 30 pieces of silver, it is a symbol learned before context, not a footnote in historical debate. That early cognitive framing matters. Institutions, church, state, school thus align, and the image hardens into a civic myth. It is revealing to trace the small acts of editing that produce the large result. A scribe adds a phrase to a gospel to make prophecy fit. A father condemns a Gnostic text and shelves it. A patron commissions a painting where Judas is ugly and moneybags bulge. A school adopts the illustration for its primer. Repeat for generations, and the image becomes incontrovertible. The method is simple. Repeat, surcharge emotionally, canonize, domesticate. But propaganda needs maintenance. Cultural producers, playwrights, filmmakers, historians with axes to grind pick the easy script. They recycle conventions, the counting of coins, the clutching of a purse, the furtive redhead in the corner. Each time, subtle possibilities are trimmed away. The Gospel of Judas is rediscovered and sensationalized as an exception, then quickly pigeonholed as heretical or romantic revisionism. The media cycle flares and fades. The dominant story shrugs and remains. Why does any of this matter today? Because the Judas script is a template. When institutions need a scapegoat, they find one. When a nation wants to explain away a collective failing, it looks for an individual villain to condemn. When powerful bodies want to close debate on an uncomfortable truth, they manufacture an image that makes questioning seem like heresy. The methods are the same. Select a detail, amplify it, attach moral language, and distribute a simple picture that crowds out nuance. And there are more insidious ripples. The moral vocabulary itself gets reshaped. Betrayal becomes a deeper sin than complicity with injustice. Loyalty becomes the supreme virtue even when the loyal person supports disastrous or immoral policies. Thus, societies prioritize an ethic of fidelity over an ethic of justice. The long shadow of Judas is not only about one man. It is about how culture prefers villains it can point at rather than systems it must confront. Visualize it as an assembly line. An event happens. A text renders it a pattern. Artists and preachers amplify. Institutions canonize. Pop culture monetizes. At the end of the line stands a product, a public memory so comfortable no one questions it. That comfortable memory tells us as much about who built it as it does about what happened. The final, uncomfortable truth is this. Dismantling the Judas myth does not sanctify Judas. It does not claim he was flawless. It does not absolve responsibility. What dismantling does, and what history must sometimes do, is restore complexity. It refuses the ease of a single scapegoat and forces us to look at the chorus of actors, the political choices, and the institutional needs that turned an ambiguous act into a doctrinal lynching. After peeling back these layers, what remains is not a sanitized hero nor a cartoon villain, but a troublemaker for our moral imagination, a man caught in an impossible position, and a culture that needed him to fail. The machine that made him a monster still hums. And that raises the question the propaganda was designed to stop us asking. If Judas served a function created by larger forces, what other convenient villains have we accepted without looking? The answer, inevitably, is that there are many. And that is precisely why the story of Judas refuses to be only ancient history. It is a manual for how collective memory is engineered. When you strip away the caricature and the sermonizing, what remains of Judas is not a moral cartoon, but a human being caught in an impossible knot. Picture him briefly in a narrow room off the temple courts. Rough hands, a ledger, a fist-sized pouch of coins, his breath visible in the cold night air. He is not a monster in the corner. He is the man who opens the door, counts resources, listens to plans, and makes decisions that look barbaric only through the glare of later simplifications. The most defensible facts are simple. He belonged to Jesus's inner circle. He held the purse. He was present at the Last Supper. Multiple early traditions, canonical and non-canonical, place him at the center of the decisive moment. Those are not partisan claims. They are convergences across documents produced for different communities and reasons. From that base, two plausible profiles emerge and then converge into a more complicated portrait. First axis: competence and trust. The group's finances were not trivial. The ministry hosted crowds, rented spaces, fed the poor, and traveled. The women who supported Jesus financially were named and, by implication, their contributions were channeled. Entrusting a single person with that role implies trust, not moral failings. In a modern shorthand, you don't give the company credit card to the colleague you suspect will embezzle. That practical trust is an important corrective to the perpetual image of Judas as a petty thief. Second axis: political sensibility and origin. The qualifier Iscariot probably signals regional, perhaps ideological, identity. If Judas came from Judea, he would have been closer to Jerusalem's political atmosphere, temple elders, high-stakes patronage, the Roman governors, than the Galilean fishermen in the band. That background could explain his different expectations for a Messiah. He may have heard the talk of revolution, the murmurs of the Sicarii, the sense that a movement had to force a crisis to change the order. Imagine Judas moving through Jerusalem's lanes, seeing petitions ignored, feeling urgency more sharply than his rural companions. That context creates motive that is strategic, not merely venal. Third axis: psychology of sacrifice. The oldest Christian texts present Jesus as foreseeing his death and naming an agent. John's line, "What you are about to do quickly," reads like a command in a play where both lead actors know their parts. If Jesus believed his death was the engine of a promised renewal, he would need someone willing to light the fuse in plain sight. Who better than the trusted steward, the man who understood numbers, timing, and the rhythms of the city? From this angle, Judas's action shifts from private treachery to grim, public ritual. It is the act of the person who accepts being the instrument when instruments are scarce. Now the hard truth: none of this exonerates cruel outcomes. If Judas expected a revelatory culmination, a dramatic uprising, or a cosmic demonstration, and instead watched his teacher humiliated, flogged, and crucified, the psychological fallout would be savage. The accounts of remorse and suicide, however they differ, index a profound dissonance between intention and result. That dissonance explains why one narrative turns him into a Satan-possessed villain, because the community needed a cause with simple morality. A complicated human who misread outcomes is harder to preach about than a devil-made traitor. So what does a more honest portrait sound like? It is not a defense. It is a hostage to ambiguity. Judas was competent. Judas was trusted. Judas probably had political and sacrificial logic that did not align with later orthodoxy. He may have accepted, perhaps even welcomed, a role that required being reviled. He almost certainly did not anticipate the full machinery of Roman and temple politics descending in the way it did. He is plausibly the most tragic figure in the movement, the one who agreed to bear the blame and then watched the plan dissolve into state violence. There are gaps we cannot fill. We do not have his words beyond the sparse gospel lines. We cannot reconstruct his inner motives with certainty. The Gospel of Judas complicates as much as it clarifies its late date, and Gnostic theology mean it is part polemic, part genuine memory. Still, the existence of alternative narratives in the early centuries tells us something crucial. The binary about Judas was not inevitable. It was manufactured. At the edge of this reconstruction sits a moral image that refuses simplification. Judas is not a saint in robes, nor a cartoon devil. He is a man who made a choice within a political religious theater that produced a catastrophic outcome. He is, perhaps, the only disciple who grasped the sacrificial logic Jesus taught, and who paid for that grasp with his name. That complexity is the restitution this figure demands neither absolution nor condemnation, but a return to human scale. If these texts were written decades after the events, for communities that needed meaning as much as memory, Mark's terse account supplies the skeleton. Matthew paints a motive 30 coins and ties it to a prophecy, retrofitting the past into a script of destiny. Luke and John escalate the moral language, possession, cosmic evil. All of this is interpretive work, not neutral reportage. The result is a narrative that reads like a courtroom drama: crime, motive, punishment. The nuance of politics, choreography, and reluctant duty is excised in favor of tidy moral lessons. By the 2nd century, the stakes had changed. Christianity was not merely a movement. It was being defended against rivals. Gnostic competitors offered other readings, ones that sometimes vindicated Judas as the one who understood Jesus. Irenaeus, the great polemicist, names such texts heretical and consigns them to silence. Canon formation is political as well as theological. Include what helps you build a single identity. Exclude what threatens that identity. Libraries become instruments of power. The selection process is antiseptic in description but brutal in effect. What survives is a curated memory, not the full archive. Art and liturgy amplify written judgment into cultural image. In medieval Europe, where the Mass formed civic rhythm, painters and sculptors reduced stories into strong icons. Judas appears with a money bag. He is painted at the edge of the Last Supper table, clutching coins. In stained glass and fresco, he is every parent's moral lesson about greed. Visual shorthand is education for the illiterate majority. It transforms a ragged, ambiguous event into a repeated pictorial sermon. Repeat the same image every Sunday for generations, and the picture replaces the messy texts. That visual repetition is propaganda at a communal scale. Next, consider political utility. When a religion becomes entwined with empire, narratives must protect the institution. If Jesus' death looks like a failure of public policy or a result of political manipulation, that is an awkward mirror for rulers. Better to make his death the result of a villain from within. Blame an individual and you absolve collectives, the movement, the institution, the leaders. In medieval and early modern politics, the Judas story functions like a social lubricant. It allows power structures to dodge responsibility by assigning sin to a scapegoat. That pattern repeats. Nations select villains to hide systemic failures. The mechanics are the same: edit, amplify, institutionalize. The cultural aftershocks are everywhere. Language absorbs the caricature. Judas becomes the generic label for the traitor. Literature and theater borrow the archetype. Modern films stage him as the useful antagonist. Each retelling chooses clarity over complexity because stories that sell sermons, plays, box office dramas prefer a cleft between hero and enemy. The nuance is costly in attention and in moral ambiguity. So popular culture colludes, whether deliberately or by the economics of narrative. There is a darker, measurable cost: the weaponization of the Judas figure against a whole people. Once a story links betrayal to a group identity, the slippage from one man to many is quick and fatal. Early Christian writers, intentionally or not, emphasized features of Judas's identity that allowed anti-Jewish rhetoric to flourish. Preachers used him as a symbol for the Jews rejecting Christ. That symbolic leap person to people was not an inevitable interpretive move. It was a choice that had consequences. Those consequences include exclusion, economic restrictions, forced conversions, and at the limit, pogroms and systemic violence. The shadow from a single narrative expanded into centuries of prejudice. Today, the Judas template continues quietly. Political campaigns demonize opponents with labels that shred nuance. Corporations seek scapegoats when scandals break. Digital media, hungry for shareable clarity, amplifies villains in 280 characters or 10-minute clips. The methods are updated algorithms, sound bites, visual edits, but the logic is the same. Manufacture a simple antagonist, repeat, and bury complexity. When you see the name Judas in a headline or a tweet, you are witnessing a cultural reflex that began long ago and was engineered to be efficient. There are signs of correction. Scholars, artists, and some religious communities have reclaimed the story's ambiguity. The discovery of the Gospel of Judas provoked a media storm precisely because it refused the neat villain. But the correction is slow and often marginalized because institutions that benefited from the simplified story still hold structural power: curricula, canon law, major media platforms. Undoing centuries of sedimented narrative requires more than a new book. It requires changing what is repeated on screens, in churches, and in classrooms. So what is at stake beyond trivia about an ancient figure? The way Judas was made into a monster is a template for how societies create scapegoats. It is a manual for the manufacture of moral clarity at the expense of truth. And the pattern repeats in modern life. Find a face, fix a label, distribute the image, and watch systems smooth themselves while attention diverts from systemic failings. The Judas case is not an isolated moral misfire. It is a cautionary diagram of cultural engineering. We have followed the edits. We have watched the pictures multiply. The final task is to redraw Judas at human scale, not to exculpate, but to recover a moral vocabulary that tolerates complexity. That retrieval is not merely historic, it is civic. When you strip the caricature away, you are forced to ask uncomfortable questions about responsibility, institutions, and who benefits when history is simplified. The next step is personal. How will you judge the villains of your own time once you see the mechanism that made Judas? You began this journey with a cinematic image, a tattered manuscript, a clandestine reveal. Then you learned the comfortable, schoolroom story, the tidy villain who sells his teacher for 30 coins. After that, the documents cracked, contradictory gospels, mismatched deaths, and a prophetic shoehorn. You walked backstage into meetings and markets, saw the Last Supper rehearsed as choreography, and then watched the slow machine of selection, art, and politics grind an ambiguous man into a single word: traitor. That is the path we traced. This episode does not aim to absolve Judas. It does not claim he was blameless or saintly. What it does claim is this: the story you were taught is partial, and that partiality was useful. It served institutions. It simplified an uncomfortable theological knot. It gave societies a handle for moral instruction and a scapegoat for political discomfort. Those are structural facts with moral consequences. So here is the question to carry forward: short, stingingly simple, and unanswered. When a society chooses a convenient villain, who cleans up the mess left behind? Think beyond Judas. Who gains when complexity is flattened? Who loses? And how many everyday judgments who we distrust, who we punish, who we exclude are built on stories edited for institutional comfort rather than on full, messy truth? If you stayed to the end of this investigation, thank you. If this video matters to you, subscribe. This channel is just beginning, and every new subscriber helps fund more dossiers that schoolrooms and textbook committees have smoothed away. Leave a comment. Where did you first learn the Judas story in your city or country? Your reply becomes part of a map of memory. Remember, Judas is not simply an ancient scandal. He is a case study in how narrative power operates. There are other files waiting, other names, other simplifications, other villains manufactured to keep institutions whole. If you want to open those files with us, stay tuned. The next dossier will ask a new question, and it will be harder still.